Eastwood, Tulsa podcast. We are so glad that you're with us. My name is Jeremy Rhodes. This is our pastor, Gordon Small.
Good to be with you today.
And we are glad that you are with us. You know, for the last several weeks, we've been talking about blind spots, and it's been a pretty amazing series here that we've been talking about. And if this is your first time joining into the podcast today, we encourage you to go back and listen to those other episodes there in this particular series. It'll definitely help you understand what we're talking about today. But today we're going to talk about the believer's judgment. And there's a lot of blind spots that come into play in this. So this particular topic of the believer's judgment is really key. Jesus said, "Judge not, lest you be judged." We've talked a lot about that from that aspect. You know, how are we going to take the beam out of our eye when we're trying to get a little speck out of our brother's eye? But yet there is a judgment that's coming, both for the believer as well as the unbeliever.
Right. And I want to be clear, and I know that people sometimes get confused because they think, well, I thought my sins and my faults and all my mistakes were placed on Jesus when he died on the cross, and that's true. But we're not going to be judged for our salvation according to our works, but we are going to be rewarded according to our works. So that's a huge difference.
That's a big difference.
Or we're going to lose rewards. It's not that we're going to be punished, but we're going to suffer the loss of rewards.
Well, let's really dive into that today, because this is where I think it does get a little confusing, because we're always taught to, in our Christian walk, is I just need to do. I just need to love the Lord. I need to serve Him. I'm not always looking for reward, but yet Scripture is very clear that God is going to reward us based on what we've done with what He's asked us to do.
Yeah, and I think maybe it might be controversial, but I think that only God really knows our true motive, and He can show us that in our quiet time. He can reveal that to us by His Spirit. But I don't think it's wrong to want to be rewarded in heaven. Good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of the Lord. And Jesus said, even a cup of cold water will not go unrewarded.
Right.
So I think that there's a balance there in why we're doing what we're doing. But if Jesus is working through us, if He's living through us, then it could be that the rewards that we get are only going to reflect glory to God, because He's really doing that in me.
Right.
So there's a fine line there between what is my motive and yes, I want to be rewarded.
Right.
Yeah. So it's not an easy thought for the Christian.
No, it's not. So as you were talking about that, I was thinking about a season for me when I was much younger, and I just turned 20. So I was working in the church that I was at and that I was attending, and I was working in our outreach ministry. So every week we would go. We had a bus that we bought, so we were going downtown, picking up all these homeless folks, bringing them to church. At the end of every church service, we had a meal for them. So it was a big deal every Sunday. And then we had an outreach minister that would visit with each person to see what their needs are. And we had several things we could give away, sleeping bags and different things like that. And so my job, because I was also leading worship, so I stayed over to help because I just wanted to help. And I was a single guy back then. And so my job at the end was to clean up. And so here I am every Sunday with the vacuum sweeper, cleaning up after everyone's meal. And with all the other things that were going on in my life and just that sweeping the carpet became one of the biggest motivation of the heart checks that I've ever had. Because every time I would sweep, I'm going, nobody ever sees anybody sweeping the carpet. We're always sitting there, it has to be done every time. And why am I the one having to do this all the time? And I would grumble and complain every single time I swept that carpet.
Well, as you're talking, I'm thinking of what Jesus said, the servant is the greatest of all.
Yeah.
And I serve, and obviously the one that's being served is greater.
Sure. I get, but the problem is that I wanted somebody to notice that I was vacuuming the carpet.
So that's what you're thinking about, the reward part.
I need to serve. I need to do this right. I clean the toilets, do whatever. But at the same time, my motivation was, I want somebody to see me doing this.
Right.
And so it was hysterical. And then finally, God got really a hold of my motivation. And when he did, I had no problem sweeping the floor and loved serving those homeless people. We saw so many of those homeless people come to Christ back in those days, and it was awesome. And it's fun now because even around Tulsa, I still see a couple of them, and now they're thriving in life instead of homeless on the street.
Yeah,
so that's really cool.
Great.
So this attitude of the heart really comes into play in the believer's judgment.
Yeah, and maybe that's, we haven't talked about building materials and how your works go through the fire, and maybe what you're talking about, some of that is burned.
Part of it. It might have been burned up.
Burned up, but that's an important part of the judgment.
Yeah, it really is. So you talked in your message on the believer's judgment out of 1 Corinthians chapter 3. And so, Corinthians, or the people in Corinth, the church in Corinth had lots of gifts. They had a lot of things going on. They were very immature. So there was a lot of strife in there, a lot of division that had happened.
They were following personalities and people, Paul and Apollos and Cephas, and then some said, well, I don't follow them, I just follow Christ. Yeah. And so they had people. Factions. Yeah. And we have the same.
We have the same thing going on today. So out of 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul talks about that our reward is that really our life is going to be tried as by fire.
Yeah, our works are going to be tried as by fire. Yeah, they're going to pass through a testing fire to see what kind of work they were, and what we use to build on the foundation, which is real important. I didn't develop that thought, but a lot of times our churches are not really built on Jesus Christ, or we deviate from that foundation and we build somewhere else.
Why is that?
I don't know. I think we want, in our culture, the American culture, we want to succeed, and we want a show. We want something that people want to come to. And I think if we're not careful, we deviate from the foundation of Jesus Christ, and we become like any other kind of an organization that's just trying to make a show or a splash.
We're just a regular humanitarian, ecumenical organization of some kind.
And I'm not saying intentionally, but it's very easy to do that.
Right.
It's very easy to do that. So I didn't develop that. What I developed were the materials that you use to build on that foundation: wood, hay, stubble, gold, silver, precious stones. Okay,
so those are the kind of the 6 items he outlines.
Yeah, and I think they may be representative, but some materials are really good, they lasting, and the others just are burned up very quickly.
Quick in a fire.
Right.
Especially like hay and stubble. I mean, that's just that's instant in a flame.
But they do make an impression. They do make a show, like a bonfire would or like a firecracker would, but they don't last. They're not lasting.
The gold, on the other hand, is I mean, even if you melt it down, you still have gold.
Yeah, and that's where we get 10, 14, 18, 24 karat gold. The more you burn it, the purer it becomes. Yeah, and it's a test of what we did with what God gave us too. So the talents, I didn't develop that. God gives us talents and abilities, but really this is what you do with the foundation that's already laid,
which is Christ.
Which is Christ,
right. Christ being the foundation, then we build on it. How we build is how God is really going to judge us in that aspect. You developed several things that I thought was extremely interesting as far as that God uses people to reach other people. Yeah. He's the one who brings about the harvest. So in this, you're kind of using these items to really say, listen, your heart motivation is huge, but God has a huge part in this whole thing as well.
Yeah, and that's what I saw when I was going through these verses. I thought we better look at the positive, not just the negative things that were going on in the Corinthian church. And we're in the greatest enterprise to reach people for Christ, and He's working in us to do that. So
I think it's interesting that in this particular church, as much division and strife that there was, is that there were still, all of these people had a massive heart for God and wanted to do something for God.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like that they were just sitting around not doing something and just sitting there arguing amongst themselves. I mean, they were passionate about reaching their city and beyond for the gospel.
Right, and Paul was pointing out, because this is the message on blind spots.
Right.
These are the blind spots that you guys are not seeing,
Right.
and he was correcting that. And I think we have some of the same blind spots today.
Yeah, you listed them as, those blind spots being envy, strife, and division.
That's a big one. Yeah, because you don't see that if you're. We're in the ministry, so it was counterproductive. You and I are on the same team for us to be battling with one another or saying, well, I follow this particular person. Why aren't we doing that here?
Right.
And then you say, well, I like this idea over here. So we could have those blind spots as ministers,
Right.
And trying to bring into our congregation what we feel like someone else is doing that's working or succeeding.
Yeah.
I follow this guy, and unintentionally have that complete
Right.
blinding over our eyes.
And a lot of that is just competition.
Yeah, we're not in competition. That really jumped out at me, because
Yeah.
that was one of my blind spots, or one that God said, you're competitive. From my background in golf and playing racquetball, my personality is to win.
Right.
And so God is showing there's no competition here.
Yeah, I had the same thing. This is a funny story from me. God was actually dealing with me about my competitiveness, because I did sports as well. I also did a lot of music and succeeded in a lot of those things. And so I was always competitive. And if you're a Rhodes, just from my family, it's inbred in you. It's like you're born with it somehow. My girls have it. We're just competitive people. And I remember God trying to get me to finally yield my competitiveness to Him. Because there is a side where that competitive nature is good when it's yielded to the Spirit of God.
Right.
But when it's not, it's where you easily get into strife. You can get into envies. You can get into a lot of stuff. And I wasn't there. And this was what's funny. I was sitting one day, and God, I heard the Spirit of the Lord just speak to my heart saying, you have a competitive spirit. And you know how competitive I was? I thought that was a good thing. He was rebuking me. And I took it as an attaboy when it was not. Later, I realized, wait a minute, God, you're not saying this is a good thing. This is a bad thing.
Yeah, it was a blind spot for you.
It was a huge blind spot. I couldn't see it. And even when God was pointed out, He was then continued to reveal the motivations of my heart, which was based in my competitiveness, my thinking. It was truly a spiritual, a spirit type of thing. That was my attitude, was to just compete. And I was striving against everybody, trying to be the best. But that was who I was.
Right.
I hope today I'm not the same way. But that was a huge blind spot for me. The next one that you talked about was just that the task of evangelism is that God uses people, but the blind spot is He doesn't have to use me.
Right. I think that's huge, because when we come to evangelism, which we probably ought to talk about sometime, because people always have hang-ups about it.
Right.
We think that they're better than I am, or he's gifted and I'm not. But what this passage is saying is God uses all of us, and it's not the one that plants or the one that waters, it's the one, that gives the increase.
Yeah.
So He's the one that's working in us, both to will and to do of His good pleasure. We need to be in that task.
Right.
Yeah.
We're all called to win souls.
Yeah.
Proverbs says, "He who wins souls is wise."
Is wise.
Is wise. The other one, this one was really eye-opening to me. Also, just not doing your best, not giving your best.
I have to give my dad credit for that growing up. He said, don't shoot for a C. Don't try to get by, but do your best. Try to make an A, and then if you get a B, so be it. So I think with God's kingdom, we sometimes try to slide. We don't do our best. We do our best with our home. I use that illustration. The Old Testament prophet said, you guys go to your cedar paneled houses, and my house lies in ruins. Not that we're trying to fix up the house like the temple of God. But if we don't do our best in what we do, then we're saying, this is not really important to me. I'm just going to slide by. So I think the materials, gold, silver, precious stones, those kind of things show that we're giving our very best. and building on that foundation of Jesus. We're not bringing a blind sacrifice or a maimed sacrifice because it's just going to be burned up. We're bringing our best.
Our best.
I think that's huge.
It is huge, especially from a motivation. The motivation of a heart is that way. Yeah, because if I am only doing 50% or I'm running on 80%, I mean, God knows that. He
Sure.
sees my heart. He knows where I'm at.
Cain and Abel, God said, if you do well, will you not be accepted? But sin is at the door. I should have used that illustration because that was the first act of giving to the Lord. And Cain did not bring his best. He brought vegetables.
He just brought what he
and
thought
God
he wanted.
did not accept that sacrifice, which is huge because we think everything that we give, God's got to accept it. No, the sacrifice had to be just right in the Old Testament. And in the New Covenant, I think it ought to even be way better than we probably think it ought to be. We can't coast.
We should be able to do much better.
Yes.
Yeah, giving our 100%. The other one is, this was some of what you alluded to at the beginning was, I'm saved. I don't have to concern myself with any other type of judgment.
Right, and you said it earlier in what we're talking about. You said that, we talked a lot about how we're not to judge other people. So we might think, well, there's no judgment for me.
Right.
I'm already saved,
I'm good.
I'm good. So that's why I think that's a huge blind spot. I think we need to remember that we're serving. And I say this very, very carefully. Our God is a consuming fire. The Bible says that in the Old Testament, all those illustrations of fire, and He says it in the New Covenant as well. God is not a trivial pursuit.
Right.
And what we do in His kingdom work is important. So that's why.
That's huge.
Yeah.
That's huge. And then the last one, just as here as we close, is shame or fear at the judgment instead of facing it boldly. That there's shame or there's fear of being judged instead of boldly facing.
Right,
that.
and someone else shared with me the 1 John, there's no fear in love, perfect love casts out fear.
Yes.
And then as He is, so are we in this world, We shouldn't be ashamed before Him at His coming. I think a lot of people feel ashamed of what they're doing. They just don't say it out loud. So one of the blind spots is that I really don't measure up, I don't do much, I'm just going to get by, I come to church. But boy, I don't really want to face that judgment because I'm probably gonna lose my. That's a blind spot that we can stand before God faultless. Jude says, with exceeding joy.
And that's huge.
That's huge. We don't want to serve out of a sense of obligation, but of love. But at the same time, we don't want to fear that I'm not going to measure up at the judgment and everything that I've done is going to burn up.
Right.
So that's a huge blind spot.
Yeah, and I mean, this is where 1 John 1:9 comes right into play.
Sure.
If we have sinned, if we have done wrong, that we can confess that, and God, who is faithful and just, will forgive us of our sin and then cleanse us from any unrighteousness.
Right, and if I did a work with an impure motive and God showed me that,
and there's cleansing for that.
Yeah.
It's huge. It's huge. Well, these blind spots are big.
And there's more. More.
There's a whole lot more. In, I think, 2 weeks, we're going to talk about the unbeliever's judgment because there's the flip side of the coin here.
Right.
And that's not a good thing.
No, it's very scary, but it's very real in God's Word, that God's a God of justice as well as love and mercy.
Yeah, and I think this is an area where I think the church is really, really blind from the fact that there is a real hell, and people are going to it every single day.
Right, and God's going to judge unbelievers like He does believers on the basis of their works. But they have no covering for their sin.
Yeah.
So God is merciful, He's fair, but I would not want to be an unbeliever with a lot of works that may have been, quote, good, because how can you do good works if you're not doing them for the Lord?
Right.
But God judges them on the basis of their works. That just is so scary to me.
It really is, because He truly is a just God.
Right.
He is a holy and a just God.
Right.
Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about the persecuted church. This coming Sunday, which is November the 4th, is going to be the International Day of Prayer for the persecuted church.
Right. We have a special speaker. I won't be speaking, but he is part of an organization called Voice of the Martyrs.
Right.
He will be speaking, and I'm really looking forward to praying for our brothers and sisters around the world that are persecuted.
Yeah. So we invite you then to join with us this Sunday online. If you're not in the Tulsa area, join us at eastwoodtulsa.org and watch that service, and then join with us in prayer, because we're going to have a specific time, a special time of prayer just in that service to pray for the persecuted church around the world. And there's a lot of things that go on. It's still many times in the news about believers who are being persecuted for their faith. So we thank you for joining us for this episode as we have continued to talk about blind spots. Next week, again, we'll talk about the persecuted church, how we can be praying for them, how you can get involved. And this has been good, Pastor.
Yeah, thank you.
This has been really good. So thanks again for joining us as we take the truths of Sunday into every day of the week. We hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time.
Blessings.